think we've gotten so gosh darn good at yelling at one another, we've forgotten how to talk to one another.
You've reached American History Hotline. You ask the questions, we get the answers. Leave a message.
Hey there, American History Hotliners. Bob Crawford, thrilled to be joining you again today for another episode of American History Hotline. It's the show where you ask the questions. And the best way to get us a question is to go to our website, AmericanHistoryHotline.com. Our new website, not Gmail anymore. Sorry about that. That's AmericanHistoryHotline.com. Once again, AmericanHistoryHotline.com. Take maybe record a voice memo of your question, or better yet, film yourself asking the question, and we'll play it on the show. We'll get an expert to answer it for you. Okay, on to today's question. It comes from Naomi. She asks, how did the Cold War end when there was so much tension for so long? Great question, Naomi. And we're going to go a little sideways with that question today because there's a new movie coming out that I think we can tie in here and I think really helps to answer your question. Joining me now is Michael Russell Gunn. He's the writer and director of the new movie, The Brink of War, which is out August 14th. Michael, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Bob. And great question from Naomi.
Excellent question. And in fact, it's a topic and the subject of your film, which we're about to talk about, has always been of great fascination to me. So very excited to have you here.
Thank you.
Michael, your film is about what you call one of the most significant diplomatic achievements most people have never heard of, the Reykjavik Summit. Can you orient us? When was this and what was going on in the Cold War at the time?
Yeah, absolutely. So, there's a lot of different moments in the Cold War that were very tense, the Cuban Missile Crisis, Able Archer in 83. But what happened in 86 was they had a new guy come into power in the Soviet Union, which was Mikhail Gorbachev. And for 6 years, Ronald Reagan had been wanting to meet somebody from the Soviet side, and they kept dying. These old guys, they kept dying. So here comes this young guy who's in his 50s, Mikhail Gorbachev, and the problem that was going on was that Ronald Reagan had, rebuilt the American military and had been showing strength in Europe by putting ballistic missiles there. And all these kind of things that were showing strength to the Soviets to try to force them to the negotiating table, but he couldn't find a partner for that. And here comes Gorbachev. And what was happening on Gorbachev's side was the Red Army was saying, we think we're going to have to go to war. If you don't figure this out really quickly, we're going to have to get rid of you and we're going to have to go to war. And so it was an incredibly tense moment to which in the room in Iceland where the film is set, they had a moment where Reagan said, I don't think this has ever happened before in human history. There's just the two of us to decide if there's going to be peace or war in the world. And it was this kind of incredibly profound moment. And so, to come full circle to Naomi's question, I think the argument that the film makes that I would make is, years later, Secretary of State Schultz was visited by Gorbachev out at Stanford in California. And he said exactly what Naomi's question was, which was, we were at the coldest point when we met, and then it was over 3 years later. How did that happen? And Gorbachev answered with a single word, which was Reykjavik. And so this film tells the story of Reykjavik and that summit, this crazy moment in history where two people, sometimes four people, got in this room and figured it out and built a relationship that led to the end of the Cold War.
I want our listeners to know that Jeff Daniels plays Ronald Reagan and Jared Harris plays Gorbachev.
Yeah.
And Harris is well known for his performance in the HBO limited series Chernobyl, which I've seen on many lists of the greatest television shows of all time.
Yes.
Okay, so Gorbachev and Reagan meet at this summit. You talked about the motivation of not going to war.
Yes.
Were there other motivations?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the biggest one was avoiding conflict, but there were ancillary ones, especially from the American perspective, which was really about human rights. And, basically, I think the Americans had for a long time post World War II really believed that allowing a Soviet sphere of influence had essentially imprisoned millions and millions of people, especially across Eastern Europe. And so it was really important to the American side, and Reagan said it in the room. We used the declassified transcripts to work through the script. There's some verbatim straight out of the transcripts. And so, the Americans came to it with a perspective that human rights were also important, that the ability of the people in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union to, have freedom of travel, freedom of speech, all these kinds of things. And so, it was Gorbachev, I think, in his willingness to not use force ultimately to oppress people, that really was the connection that Reagan and Gorbachev made. That they were two human beings who put their humanity first before their ideology, before their political systems and economic systems, and that ultimately was the breakthrough. They were able to have trust, and once that trust was established, then everything else was possible.
There's a famous Reagan line that
Yes,
has survived this time period and is still used today. He
yes,
would say, "Trust but verify." Did you know what I was going to say?
yes. Trust but
Trust
verify.
but verify, right?
Yeah,
Is this where that line comes from?
yes. This is where that line comes from.
And so there's a tagline somewhere for the film. It says, "Can you trust an enemy?"
Yes,
Right? So how did Reagan come to make this deal with our perceived, and
yes,
pop culture at the time told us that the
yes,
Soviets were our greatest enemies.
yes. Well, I think that phrase that you referenced, "trust but verify," was he was a very savvy negotiator. Ultimately Reagan, and that was a Russian parable. He was quoting it in Russian to Gorbachev, and I'm going to butcher the Russian, so I'll try to avoid that. But it's "trust but verify" in English. And, the thing that he really said was, let's make a relationship, let's build trust in this room, and then verify what we can do in the real world based on that. That if we're going to say, hey, let's find an agreement to reduce nuclear arms, then how do we verify it? Becomes, what do we do to verify that? And that was stuff that they left to advisors, to the generals to figure out. But the key factor to Reagan was that they had had 40 years of evidence of the Soviets, cheating on, different control measures. And so, and I think, on the Gorbachev side, on the Russian side, I think that it was a shocking moment to be asked to open their system, but it was one they were willing to do. And it's one of these crazy true things in history that I think we've forgotten. But up until a few years ago, into the Ukraine conflict, they still allowed Russian and American planes to fly over our countries and just check on our nuclear sites. It's kind of surreal to think about, at least to me, growing up so many years after this, to think about a Russian plane flying over South Dakota or wherever to check the
Yeah.
silos.
Yeah, so the big aspect of this negotiation is over reducing our nuclear ar- arsenals for
Yes,
both countries.
yes.
Talk about that. Talk about what trips them up in these
Mm.
negotiations.
Well, they both brought a lot of ideas about how to do it to the table, and both brought up a lot of different things that they wanted to talk about. But the key factor was that they had 70,000 nuclear weapons pointed at each other. And Gorbachev said to Reagan, I was very inspired by your first campaign where you called for nuclear zero. And so he, in this crazy true moment, he slides a piece of paper across the table that says, we're willing to reduce the nuclear weapons in Europe to zero. And all of a sudden, dialogue opens and they start to negotiate and they start to realize where the lines are for each person. And they get so far that at one point they had a deal to get rid of all nuclear weapons on Earth. And it falls apart over one word. This is all true. It's on the transcripts. But I would say to find out the word, Bob, you gotta go to the theater on August 14th to find out what the one word was.
And if I'm not mistaken, the negotiations break down,
Yes,
right?
correct.
And Reagan, he's going to stay there, and it gets later and later at night. He tells his, and this is off of memory, and correct me
Yeah.
if I'm wrong. He tells Nancy, "I'm going to be home by dinner."
Yeah, yes,
Right?
that's
Isn't
right.
this true?
Yeah,
And
that's right.
it doesn't happen, right? And
Correct.
they don't have a. But we talked before we started the interview about our mutual friend Pete Souza, who
Yes.
was Reagan's photographer at the time, who
Yeah.
took, and for those listening, you can't see, but for those watching, these are the photos of when it breaks down. This is a photo of when it breaks down. And if you look at Reagan's face there, you can just see the disappointment and the
Yeah.
frustration.
Yeah.
So we're not going to mention the word.
No, we're
Okay.
not gonna mention the word.
I
I mean,
know,
no
I think I
spoilers.
know that word. I think I know that word. Okay. George Shultz,
Yes.
he was Secretary of State.
Yes.
Is it correct that I read that a lot of what you guys you had access to his notes?
Yeah, so I owe him. I mean, truly, Bob, like in a most human way, I owe him. He's a hero of mine. He's one of only two people in history to serve in four different cabinet positions. You know, he was a Marine in World War II. He devoted his whole life to public service. And so the film, my thing for him was the film was dedicated to him. Like he devoted himself to the American people and public service, and I wanted to honor that.
Did you
And
ever get to meet him?
I did. I met him several times. I interviewed him for hours, and he gave me the declassified transcripts. They were still stamped classified at the top, which was a little unnerving for me, but they were recently declassified, and he gave me those, and that was what formed the basis of the script. And he told incredible stories. You know, one of the more profound things that I put in the film, but just shocked me, was he said the first time he saw the two military officers holding both, nuclear footballs, the controls for all the nuclear weapons on Earth in this room, these two guys facing off against one another, one Soviet, one American. And he just thought, wow, if we just press the button, it's all over right here. So that was really incredible.
And you were able to film this in the actual room where it happened.
We filmed in the actual room where it happened.
Talk about the vibes.
The vibes were intense. I can tell you that much. I mean, not only the room, we had they went to the archives in Iceland and got the paintings back on the wall. The guys, Jeff and Jared, are sitting in the seats where Reagan and Gorbachev sat. And so if you're a history nerd like me, that was about as the pinnacle as you could get. We were in that room. The North Atlantic waves are crashing, outside. The poor sound design team, they had to record with the wind coming through the house off the North Atlantic. So it was about as real as we could make it.
Yeah, I know from doing location film sound in another life, you want it silent in there. You add that stuff in later.
Yes, correct.
So I'm sure the sound men were going nuts.
They were going nuts. And, remember, these chairs are, more than 40 years old. So they're squeaking, and the guys are moving around, and, you got cameras in there. We got dollies in there. It was a challenge for the sound team.
The battle between camera department and the sound department is never ending.
Never
Okay.
ending.
So was it hard to get these archival materials? I mean, is there a process for this? Obviously there must be. And was it challenging?
Yes, it was. I mean, we did tons of research. I mean, I did tons of research for the script, interviewing people, reading, all that kind of stuff. And then for the production process, we did everything humanly possible. And to come back to Pete Souza, his proofs that we drew out of the National Security Archives still had his name on them written in his kind of, pen, or even grease pencil. I think some of them had the grease pencil mark still on them. And so we took those, we'd go to the costumer, right? And she would have the ties. We couldn't find the ties that the guys wore. So you had to go and 3D print the ties. We would go and take them to the production designer and say, we need it to look like this. And, a funny kind of weird aside is that, Hofti, the house where it happened, is right in the middle of Iceland. And so Iceland has kind of grown up around it. So, it came right down to the camera angles that we had to choose in order to make sure we weren't showing this, bank building, that's right next to Hofti now.
Yeah, this is 40 some years ago,
Yeah,
about 40 years ago.
yeah.
This is American History Hotline. I'm your host, Bob Crawford. Today, my guest is Michael Russell Gunn. He's the writer and director of the new movie, The Brink of War, which is out on August 14th. Remember, send us your burning questions about American history. You can do that at our new website, AmericanHistoryHotline.com. That's AmericanHistoryHotline.com. Now back to the show. Michael, how does the film end? Now, I don't want we're not going to give it away. We're not going to give it away for free here. But would you say this meeting was the end of the Cold War?
I think certainly it was the beginning of the end of the Cold War. And I think that the relationship that they built, Reagan on one side and Gorbachev on the other side, the relationship that they built led directly to the end of the Cold War. And even more so than that, the, you know, it's an interesting perspective. I think sometimes, we get a little myopic in our perspectives in history. And the truth of it was we were the ones who thought it was a failure at the time. And then we were frustrated and we walked away thinking it was a failure. Even Schultz had his doubts. But the Soviets knew immediately that they had had a breakthrough. Gorbachev goes right to a press conference and says, "This is a great meeting. Like, we made real progress here." And so what the film does is it's a little bit of a perspective shift, in that the last few minutes of the film shift in a kind of philosophical way to the Soviet perspective, to see how this was the beginning of the end of the Cold War. And so it's an incredible, monologue that J.K. Simmons does, completely off book and with no playback. You'll appreciate this, Bob. No playback whatsoever. He just did it. And we all looked at each other on set and couldn't believe it. But, he gives this monologue where he says we didn't know, but this was it. And so it's an incredible thing that I think has been lost to history. It's one of the most pivotal moments in human history.
The film feels relevant to right now, to what's
Yes.
going on, to
Yes.
United States-Russia relations.
Yes.
Two countries that are still enemies. Things are complicated. Talk about that for a second. Like, talk about what you've thought about kind of personally, in making this film, in where we've come, our two
Mm.
nations, and the complex relationship. It seems like Putin is in some ways looking to regain
Mm-hmm.
what Gorbachev gave away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think, Putin was famously a KGB officer stationed in East Germany. He views the fall of the Soviet Union as one of the great tragedies that befell his country. And so I think he is diametrically opposed to Gorbachev's vision for peace. And so I think things are, fraught in a way. And, some of the treaties that Reykjavik led to, the INF Treaty, which reduced nuclear arms, these were pivotal moments in human history where, for the first time, people voluntarily agreed to give up weapons. That had never happened. And these were the worst kind of weapons, right? The nuclear weapons. And so what comes out of Reykjavik is this ultimately a 90% reduction of nuclear weapons. It's hard to fathom that, but 90%. And for the first time, these agreements are expiring. China is building more nuclear weapons now than they have before. Russia is building more tactical weapons. So for the first time since these events, we have this kind of, history echoing back at us, rhyming back at us.
And also, we are locked in an actual hot war, not a cold war, with a nation that seeks to build nuclear weapons. And
Yeah.
there's nuclear materials in the balance here.
Yeah.
What is there a way? Can this meeting between Reagan and Gorbachev somehow inform the current administration with how to go about negotiating with Iran, or are these just completely different things, different times, different people? Are we just kind of in uncharted territory?
It's a great question. I think that, we've all gotten so used there's this great phrase I think we all know, especially us history fans, is that, history, if you don't learn it, you're doomed to repeat it, kind of thing. I personally think that's a little bit of a misnomer, that there's no direct linkage. Reagan's been passed, unfortunately, for 20 years. He governed 40 years ago. This idea that we can draw direct parallels, I think, is a little bit of a mistake. It kind of lets people off the hook in dealing with the situations as they present themselves. And so I think the critical factor is that the themes of being willing to engage with somebody is always important. And it's not just at the geopolitical level. I made this film because, I've said it to my producers many times, but I think we've gotten so gosh darn good at yelling at one another, we've forgotten how to talk to one another. And I think that that's our neighbors, that's our communities, it informs everything. And so that's the reason I made the film. I wanted to make the film about two men who had every reason to hate one another and disagree, and yet still they found a way to talk. That was inspiring to me.
Why did the negotiations take place in Iceland?
Oh.
Why Iceland?
Why Iceland? So the answer is quite simple, actually. In the end of the day, they chose Iceland because it was incredibly secure. This was an impromptu meeting. It came together in a couple of weeks, literally, and they decided they need the most secure place they could find. And here was this little house on the coast of Iceland with nothing else around it, in the middle of an island in the middle of the North Atlantic. So it was a really secure place. And so they did that, and they were successful. It was, they didn't have committees, they didn't have press. They just had these guys in this little house. And, a funny little tidbit from history that, that isn't out there yet, but I hope people enjoying the film, is that the Icelandic people definitely believe that it's haunted. So here you've got Reagan and Gorbachev in a haunted house in Iceland trying to figure out the fate of the world.
It's the setting. It is the setting that just feels like it made all that came from it possible.
Yes, 100%.
So before I let you go, the actors.
Yeah.
We know Jeff Daniels is an incredible actor.
Yeah.
Based on his body of work. Can you let us in your knowledge of how he prepared to play Ronald Reagan?
Well, Jeff, as you alluded, Jeff is an incredible actor. He's done everything. I first got to know him on the Newsroom. I came up under Aaron Sorkin. He was my hero. He's my mentor. And I'm watching this guy do, if you know film, he's doing like 12 pages a day, this Sorkin dialogue. And I thought, man, this is the guy that I grew up watching, like, do Arachnophobia and Dumb and Dumber and, like, everything. Purple Rose of Cairo. I was like, how does this guy not have like 2 Oscars on his mantle already? Like, who is this guy? And so the first thing was I knew he could handle it. So when I wrote it, I knew he could do it. I'd seen him. He's incredible.
So it was always him in your mind.
It was always him. And it was really a question of, like, does he want to? So I write him this letter and I send it to his agent and say, read the script, tell me. And luckily he did. Luckily he wanted to do it. And he spent 6 or 7 months on the accent, watching video, listening. He'd bike around his, neighborhood, listening to Reagan's voice. He got in the chair for 2 hours a day to get the makeup and hair right. And so he really brought it. And he never left set. If you've ever been on a film set or a TV set, usually the actors, you cut, they walk off set, they go to their trailer. He wouldn't leave. He stayed there. We relit, we turned the cameras around, and he just stayed right there in that chair.
Absolutely amazing. I've been talking with Michael Russell Gunn. He's the writer and director of the new movie, The Brink of War, which is out August 14th. Go see it. I know I will. Michael, thank you for joining us today on American History Hotline.
Thank you so much, Bob.